Welcome, guys. I hope you're all finding your way to this live stream, where we'll be doing some questions and answers. I've started the stream a little bit earlier than the scheduled time, just to allow for those people who need to join. How's it, Carl? I see you found your way there. This is the first time we're doing this, so I just want to allow for a few minutes for people to start joining, and be sure to find us. So at least I see the comments are coming through. How's it, Tammy and Renee? I see you guys are yet to join, so it looks like people are finding it relatively easily. So while we just give people some time to join in on the conversation, I just want to quickly touch on a few things. I think the first thing is we have been running workshops. Prior to COVID-19, we'd been running workshops for property buyers as well as property investors, and we were doing them at the end of the month, and the last Wednesday of the month and the first Wednesday of the new month. That, in the meantime, has obviously been had to be halted, as we can't operate and meet as a group. But what we're now looking at doing is, I'm considering moving that online to this platform. So there have been a lot of questions as to whether this session tonight is the replacement for those workshops, and the answer is simply no. So what I want to do tonight is maybe address questions that have been sent through. There has been sort of a common thread and theme coming through, and as much as I am tired of speaking about COVID-19, and I think you may be of hearing about COVID-19, I do still think there's a place for certain discussions around that. So a lot of the questions that came in obviously were surrounding COVID-19 and the implications that it has on property transactions, the property environment, and how we suggest people deal with it. So I'm just going to be checking as we see people joining in. I see you, Lundy and Verna, Nick. I see you guys are all here. Yushrik, how's it? Okay, great. So it looks like people are finding their way relatively easily. What I want to do is, I'm not able to, I'm not sure where you guys are commenting. If you're commenting on the video sort of comment section, I'll try my best to pick up the comments there and the questions that you're sending through. Otherwise, also, the easiest way perhaps for me to moderate on my side and to collate what's coming through would be if you email it to me. So my email address is Rowan, Rowan, at aspg.co.za. That's Rowan at aspg.co.za. I'll drop it for you quickly in this comment section where you guys are all currently commenting. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to email them to me. It might just be easier for me to read. Alternatively, you can drop them in these comments and we can come back. So, okay, so that's just sort of from a procedure point of view. This doesn't replace the workshops. I'll probably look at getting those workshops going again as of next week. We've covered the question process. And then I just want to also just mention something that I don't have a crystal ball. And as much as I'd like to have one, and as much as I'd like to make you believe that I have one, I simply don't. So all the views that I share here tonight are based on my opinion and my feeling and, my experience in dealing with people in the market and getting feedback from not only our agents, but also industry peers, and, making it my mission to understand how these how this environment that we're operating in the moment will have an effect on our business. I think we managed to do it pretty well when we had the uncertainty around land expropriation. And I think, the sort of research and the message that we put out was carried across well. So on that note, again, please remember that all the questions that I'm going to be answering are based on my opinion and can't be taken as fact. So but I'd like to engage with you guys on that and encourage you to ask questions and probe. So I think I'm going to run through some of the questions. I post them in the discussion section. A lot of the questions that came through. So I think you guys could see that a lot of them overlap. And some of them we possibly going to, not necessarily answer directly, but they will be collateral in other answers. So the first, I'm going to answer the easy and quick ones first. And yes, they do, go around COVID-19 because that's, I think, is the thing that's on everyone's minds. A lot of the questions don't, but I think let's just deal with the quick ones first. So first off, the questions come through about the deeds office opening and when clients will be allowed to move or when you'll be able to move, whether it be for rentals or sales. If a property registers or it registered just before lockdown or it's now going to register because the deeds office is busy opening. What happens to moving? Are you allowed to move? Can you apply for some special permit, like some people have been purporting in the media and sharing on social media? That's completely fake news. So trust me, if you were allowed to move, we'd be the first people to notify you. But there are no movements allowed at this stage. There's no permits that can be had. Unfortunately, we're stuck in the position where we are. So just from a practical point of view, what that means, if your agreement of sale has registered and the property is now in your name and you need to move into that property, or if you're needing to vacate the property, most good agreements of sale would make provision for occupation rent. So occupation rent will now be payable by the occupant of the property to the registered owner. So that would be the scenario now. Unfortunately, I know the next question is going to be, but how long can I do that? And how long do I need to do that? And I can't be doing it. I can't continue paying occupational rent forever. Unfortunately, those are, that's the reality. That's where we're at. And if there are specific concerns around that, I think the best way to manage that is to actually engage in discussion with the parties, surrounding your specific transaction. But do remember that legally you're not allowed to move. And the implication means that there'll be occupational rent due, lease agreements, if they're expiring, they're moving over to a month-to-month basis, and there's still an obligation to fulfill from a landlord side and a tenant side all the obligations that arise from that agreement of sale or lease. So I think that maybe sets the tone for one of the questions. Another question that came through was regarding OTP cancellation. So cancellations of agreement of sale now, as a result of this COVID-19 and maybe a change in financial position and so on. There's no blanket answer. Okay, so the terms of your cancellation or your agreement coming to an end or continuing will be contained in the details of that contract. So you need to have a look at whether there were any suspensive conditions like bond approvals, the sale of a home, and then also have a look at could those be executed now? Have they been executed, and how easily can or can't they be executed? If your agreement of sale was subject to a bond and you've received the bond, you are bound. You fulfilled your obligation. If circumstances change and the bank withdraws the approvals, obviously, there's nothing that you can do surrounding that, and whether you want to proceed or not. And there has been notice that banks are starting to rescore clients, who were possibly approved prior to the lockdown and are now entering, now looking at registration with the deeds office opening. There may be a rescoring, but legally and contractually, you're obliged to continue with the agreement of sale. So there's lots of different opinions floating around, as to vis major and force major and a number of different concepts, legal, that need to be tested. And someone's going to have to approach the court and execute that and have it tested. But for now, you can rely on the conditions contained in your specific agreement of sale and reflect to that. And what I found out of that is that 99% of agreements will remain in force. and effect unless circumstances have changed where the bank has intervened. All right, so I think that answers that question, hopefully. The third question, deals with, I think this is where we start dealing with some of the juicier stuff, is will there be an opportunity, to bargain buy and buy on auction and possibly get some form of a reduced purchase price because of this COVID-19 and sort of capitalize on opportunities that there may be in the market. Now, I think I think I think we need to have a look at property pricing, and how this may affect property pricing along with this question, because this assumes that there'll be some downward pressure on pricing, or that there'll be a segment of the market which will have downward pressure on pricing. And my view on that is that I don't think property prices are going to be affected that severely during this time. I think what you're going to see is you're probably going to see a reduced volume of transactions, but I don't think you're going to see such a severe downward trend in pricing. Why do I say that? What are the reasons for me saying that? I think to share with you maybe where my mindset and where my thoughts are at is, first of all, 2007, 2008, 9, when we had those tremendous years in property that there were severe crashes. Property was central, and almost the cause, and the financial mechanisms behind property were the cause of that collapse, that market collapse. I think that's very important to understand. So when you come to terms with that, you can understand that it was the mechanisms behind property, as well as the dealings of the property industry and the financing mechanisms behind that actually caused everything. This time, property is collateral, like every other industry. And that's why I expect there to be less of a devastating effect on the property market. I think, you're going to see that, as I said, you're going to see a reduction in volumes of transactions, but you're not necessarily going to see such severe downward pressure in pricing. The next factor, that I attribute to that, or that I use in support of that, is to say that our financial system is a lot better prepared. If you have a look in 2008, a lot of what happened in that time, a lot of the auctions and the repercussions that happened during that time were as a result of reckless lending prior. If people had made responsible lending decisions in the years prior to 2008, the amount of repossessions and wouldn't have had to be as high as what it was. But unfortunately, it was less regulated. In some places like the States, they were actually lending people money who were living in caravans and caravan parks, as mortgages. None of that was ever sustainable. But today that has changed. We have a very strong banking system in that regard. There's a number of fail-safes, and we've learned from what happened. As the industry that was hardest hit in 2008 and 9, the industry and all its associated factors have learned from that. Today, you see, you'll see that there's help you sell programs from the bank. Look at what we've done now. The industry has done now in allowing for payment holidays, making restructuring of loans available. So there's a lot that's been done by the financial sector behind us to actually protect and to stop an absolute downward spiral. And I think that's confidence inspiring, and that will go a long way in protecting property values. Again, I think, volume and transactions is going to be down because, supply won't be under so much, there won't be such a big wave of supply. People are getting themselves payment holidays, and they're restructuring their loans. So if you have a look back to 2008, 2009, and even preceding that, the previous recession before that, 98, 99, and then again in 07 and 08, and then continuing until now, there's been a downward trend in auctions. On Cape Talk a while back when I was on the radio, I did a discussion with them around, property auctions, and how that property auctions in 2008 and 9, at one stage in the peak, the city of Cape Town, the metropole, had about 1,200 auctions, I think, at the peak. I could be wrong. And that figure is down to about 100 last year. So we're looking at about 8 or 10% of auctions as compared to the previous recession. Now, yes, we haven't quite entered the phase as to where people can't pay and repossessions start taking place, but that downward trend has been continuing since 2008 up until 2019. And I believe the reason for that is better lending criteria, more of a conscience by the banks who are lending and who caused a lot of the reckless repossessions of the past. There's been a lot of changes in the auctioneering side of the business and regulations surrounding that and price determination. And I think consumers have just become a lot more conscious about potential repercussions, and the banks are better prepared for that. So I don't foresee a huge drop in pricing. And in saying that, therefore, I don't see a huge opportunity, in sort of bargain buying. Yes, there will be people who cannot afford to maintain their properties and continue paying their bonds. That's the reality. That's life. We had a desperate point. But as a market, as a collective market, I think we'll get through this a lot better in terms of pricing and dealing with this crisis. Okay, so that's some of the quicker questions that, or not quicker, but some of the questions that came through that I've tried to collate. The next one was around interest rates. There was a lot of questions surrounding interest rates and interest rate projections. From my side, opinion as to what I think interest rates are going to be doing, and also questions as to whether you should fix interest rates or stay on a variable interest rate at this point in time. So just to clarify for everyone's understanding, a variable interest rate would be the traditional way of entering into a loan agreement. So where the bank offers you a loan at prime or prime plus 1% or prime minus 0.1 or minus 1 or minus 2 or plus 3, whatever the case may be in any spectrum. So, or any way in between that. And as the prime lending rate goes up or down, so does the rate at which, or the interest rate at which they lend you money also varies. So that's what we've seen happening now. I mean, since the 1st of January, we've had just on 2.5% or 2.25% interest rate reductions. We're down to 7.75% as of 10% previously. So, we've seen a lot of interest rate reduction. Now the question comes up is, how does this interest rate look going forward? A lot of, sort of the credible resources who I've been following are giving us indications that the interest rates will actually continue to drop. I think at one stage they were talking about another 0.5, another 0.25 to 0.5, so 25 to 50 basis points this year, with another 25 basis points in next year. And that will bring another 0.75% relief as to where we are. I support that view, and I think that that's where we're going to be at. I don't think there's any risk of inflation or hyperinflation. Demand just simply isn't there. So I think we're staying in a space where there will be relatively low interest rates as compared to before. Now, that then begs the question, but do I peg my interest rate now to a fixed interest rate so that I have that benefit of actually paying a fixed rate while it's low? Or do I allow for this variation in interest rate and ride the waves out? And I want to just touch on the concept of that, because if you enter into a fixed interest rate agreement, that means that the bank is eliminating a certain amount of risk for you. Okay, that's the whole premise and the whole basis of you entering into that agreement. So that's going to come at a cost. and that cost is usually quite high. So you are able to fix your interest rates at this point in time to anywhere between, I think it's 6 months is the minimum, and 5 years is the maximum. I got some quotes today from the various banks. They're not too forthcoming yet as to what that variable versus fixed rate premium would be. A lot of them will do it based on your individual preference, but one of the banks was actually willing to share where their minds are at with that. And I want to read to you quickly just some of the premiums that they are applying to fixed interest rates as opposed to variable interest rates. So this is, I won't disclose the bank, but I will just say their sort of train of thought. So 12 months fixed term option as opposed to the variable rate for 12 months, they'll add an additional 14 basis points. So that means 0.0 or 0.14% to your interest rate. So if you're currently at prime, if you want to fix your interest rate for 12 months, they will only add 0.14%. So it will become prime plus 0.14%. If you want to look at 24 months, they'll be adding 0.37%. Okay, so 37 basis points. If you're looking at 36 months, they'll be adding 78 basis points. So that's 0.78%. 48 months, so that's 4 years, they start raising that to 1.2%. And remember, this is not an incremental raising of the fixed rate. This is a fixed rate from day one. So if you want that rate, you need to sign at 1.2% above whatever rate you currently have to get that benefit for 4 years. And if we push that up to 5 years, 60 months, which from my findings is the longest period I'd be willing to do it, or be allowed to do it, they actually raised that by 1.51%, so 151 basis points. So now one has to consider, well, if the bank's taking away this risk for you, they're absorbing it. And at what price would they be able to absorb it? And at what price would they be willing to absorb it? And if we look at the short-term forecast, 12 months, 24, 36, 48 months, we're looking at 0.14, 0.37, 0.78%. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the banks are willing to price it at a very small premium. And why would they be pricing it at a very small premium? Because they don't anticipate it to rise. Okay, if the banks were pegging a massive premium to fixing the interest rate in the short term, they would be anticipating interest rates rising. Okay, so all of their modeling, all of the economists, all of their forecasting is indicating that there won't be rising. But there's obviously a certain amount of risk and uncertainty that they need to factor into their pricing. That should give you the first indication that that they don't anticipate interest rates rising. Whether you understand the interest rate market or not, that's the quickest way to understand it. And from this, I think it's pretty clear that even the banks are saying interest rates are going to remain quite low. So I don't believe that it's the right time to be fixing your interest rates. I don't think it's a good idea. I think interest rates could possibly come down even more. And remember that you can only fix it for a certain amount of time. So fixing it for that amount of time, if it's 24 months or 36 months, any downward, relief that we get in interest rates, you're not gonna experience the benefit of. And you typically pay the most interest on your loan in the early stages. So if you're at the end of your loan and you're possibly looking at retirement and you just want certainty for the next 6 or 12 months or 24 months because you're planning retirement or something like that, and you're willing to pay that additional cost just to remove the uncertainty, yes, there is a place in the market for a fixed interest rate. But I don't think it's the right thing for the average man on the street to be doing at this point in time. It is a niche product. So let's, my recommendation would be don't fix it. Fran, I think the question came from you regarding, is there a specific time that you need to, own the property before you may apply for a fixed rate? And that answer is no. There's no limit. And then the last thing, just regarding fixed rates, which, again, makes me sort of allergic to them, is that you lose your you immediately lose your access facility. Okay, so your access facility that you have on your home loan will immediately be lost if you move to a fixed interest rate. Okay, that's the feeling across the board that I've the feedback that I've received. So the ability to save in your bond and to pump extra cash into your bond and be able to withdraw it at a later stage, that's lost the moment you go into a fixed interest rate agreement. So I don't think, again, as I've said, if you're at the end of your loan, you're potentially looking at retirement, your circumstances are such that you just want that certainty for the 12 or 24 months or whatever, there might be a place for you to do it. But again, the odds are stacked against you if you are the average man on the street. Okay, so then just there was another question which came through around what a flexi facility is, a flexi bond is, and or access accounts as that may be known. An access account or a flexi account is a provision within your bond which states that any amount that you pay back over and above the contractual obligation that you have for that period can be withdrawn again. Okay, so anything that you pay over and above the amount that you have to contractually pay can be accessed or withdrawn again. So to make the example practical, if you have a 10,000 Rand a month bond and you keep paying 10,000 Rand a month, you will pay the bank or be obliged to pay the bank 120,000 Rand a year. That's a minimum payment. It's not your restriction. You're allowed to pay back more, but that would be the minimum. So the moment you up that payment to say 15,000 Rand a month, and you're paying an additional 3,000 Rand, that means at the end of the year, you'll have 3,000 Rand a month times 12, which gives you 36,000 Rand, which you can then have available again on access to withdraw. Okay, so that's the concept of an access facility, is everything that you pay back over and above your contractual obligation, you are allowed to withdraw it again. That can be done through incremental payments. It can be done, you don't even have to commit to paying more every month. You can sort of ad hoc pay in. If you've got 500 Rand, pay it in. If you've got 10,000 Rand, pay it in. If you've got 100,000 Rand, pay it in. Or if you want to just pay 1,500 Rand a month, do that. The benefit of that, and what I sometimes find people doing is saving in separate bank accounts. So they've got a fixed savings account here, and they've got another savings account there, and they're all getting reduced interest rates, but they're being charged a high interest rate on their mortgage bond, where they've actually got a flexi facility. Save that money in your bond, and immediately you'll be saving whatever your interest rate is. So say today, you'll be saving, if you're on prime, you'll be saving 7.75% of interest that you don't have to pay. Whereas if you're saving it in some savings account today, you're probably going to get 3.5% or 4% interest. So, it's not, it doesn't make sense to be saving anywhere else. You should be saving in your access facility. And if you don't have an access facility, you need to register and apply for one. It doesn't cost you anything. All I know, I personally bank with ABSA, and that's why I know it, is that all ABSA bank bonds have access facilities or flexi facilities linked to it. There was another question which came through regarding how do I actually go and make payments into my access bond or into my bond, and if I want to pay in extra money. Usually you get that by means of making a transfer simply into that bank account number. So every bank, they'll have a dedicated account like which is reflective of your bond. And that will be like making a normal EFT payment to a beneficiary. And you will do that, and the banks will then reduce your payment monthly. They'll keep the term the same as a standard, and they'll reduce your payment because that money is available again on access. So if you withdraw it again, then your installment goes up again. If you pay it back in, your installment drops, but your term remains the same because your interest is calculated daily. Okay, we could probably spend the whole night speaking about access facilities, but That's the concept. If you haven't got one, get one. It's easy. It's easy to get them registered or activated. It's easy to make payments in them, and it's the best way to be saving rather than some other accounts on your bank. Where you're getting less interest. Stick it into your Access. Then another question which came through was then, but in this time where interest rates are reduced, can't I, continue paying my old bond installment because I'm able to, maintain paying that old bond installment? And the answer is yes, you can. There's no that your bond obligation is only a minimum payment obligation. If you would like to keep your debit order at the higher amount, you can do that. The nice thing is that it will reduce your term. Okay, it will shorten your term. I did the calculations this afternoon. If you're running from the 1st of January compared to today, the 2.25% interest rate reduction on a loan will reduce your payment period from 20 years to 14 and a half. So it takes off 5.5 years that you save on bond repayments. If you continue paying what you were paying at the beginning of the year, despite the reduced interest rates, if you just keep your payment the same, you'll be shortening your bond period by 5.5 years. That's how powerful this interest rate reductions that we've had are. Okay, I mean, there's many variables that may go up and down again in the future, but you need to make your decisions based on now. And if you continue paying the bond installment today that you were paying previously, and all things stay the same, you will reduce that bond payment by 5.5 years. I mean, that's massive. Take those payments, and times it by 5.5 years, and you see the amount of money that you save over that period. We did a lot of calculations when they came out, showing people how much more they qualify for, how much the savings are, how much quicker you're going to be repaying your bond. If you want to have a look at them, scan around on our website and our Facebook pages. We've shared it there, or get in contact with me and I'll send you those figures on a separate email. So the interest rate reductions have been very powerful, and they'll allow us to either repay our bonds quicker, or, if you continue paying that same amount, have access available again. Okay, so if you guys understand the access, then you'll be able to understand why I'm an advocate of a 30-year bond rather than a 20-year bond. Okay, it doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. You say to me, Rowan, 30-year bonds, I'm going to be paying my loan back for 30 years and I'm going to be paying 30 years worth of interest. Just proven to you that you don't have to. You can make the equivalent of a 20-year payment. You can take out the 30-year bond, put your debit order on a 20-year payment, and every month, the difference between the two payments, the reduced payment that you're obliged to make and the 20-year payment that you're actually making, will be available on Access. So if you've got the ability to apply for a 30-year bond, but you're opting for a 20-year bond, you're silly. Times like this show us that having access to cash available in hand and having access to carry you through these difficult periods, that's the best way to be dealing with this. You can give yourself a payment holiday, okay, if you have access available. You don't have to be applying to the bank to do that. And that's why I'm an advocate for a 30-year bond. No one's going to be paying off their bond for 30 years or 20 years. 30 years' time, you're probably going to be walking into the bank, with the equivalent of 2 months' worth of salary, would probably be the equivalent of a bond, of your entire bond amount of 2 years ago or 30 years ago. If you think what property prices were back 30 years ago, no one's going to be paying that, off for 30 years. And it's only a minimum payment. So if you opt for a 30-year bond, I'm not saying make the 30-year bond repayment. Pay the equivalent of a 20-year payment. That gives you the power and the ability to build up access. It gives you the ability, when times are tough, when you have unforeseen expenses, to not be obliged to make the higher payment. You can opt to make the minimum commitment payment. But if you stack in a 20-year or a 15-year bond, and that's your minimum obligation, is the high installment, you don't have very many options. Okay, so opt for the longer terms. Gives you options, it gives you flexibility. One of the core things I recommend to anybody investing in properties: have options. The more options you have, the less money it's going to cost you. So, that's one of the things that we talk about in the investment workshop that I hope to get going again next week. So, I hope I've answered that question regarding 20 versus 30-year bonds, and at the same time covered the flexi account. So I just want to check quickly, because I think, as I predicted, we're covering a lot of different questions at the same time. So let's just go through some of these questions quickly. Okay, so another question which maybe sort of spills off that was refinancing versus a payment holiday. What's the difference? Where's there a place in the market for that, and how do they differ? So I published an article a while back, sort of stating what the refinancing is about and how it's affected. And then also there's been quite extensive coverage about payment holidays. So in concept, refinancing is coming to a new arrangement with the bank on your existing loan. So irrespective of where your loan is at, you can head back to the bank and negotiate terms, maybe reset. If you were on a 20-year bond and you've paid off 5 years and you've got 15 years remaining, you could possibly look at resetting it to 20 years. You could potentially look at extending a 20-year bond to a 30-year bond. You could potentially look at taking out a further bond on your property, so a second bond, raising the amount of capital you have available. There'd obviously be provisions you'd need to be able to afford to pay it back. So you'd need, you'd need to have the power to and the ability to pay it back, and the property would have to offer sufficient security to do that. So there'd need to be enough equity in the property. But refinancing is an option in these periods. It allows you to withdraw cash, out of a property where you've previously possibly put in deposits, or where your property has grown in value and you are able to access some additional funds. So refinancing is there, and the best way to do that is to speak to a bond consultant and have a look at the different options you have to refinance your existing property. The next option, is the payment holiday. So the payment holidays, there were questions that came in. I think everyone knows what these payment holidays are. The banks have expressed them quite nicely. So it's simply a pause in payments so for 3 months, you don't have to repay your debt payments. Okay, how does this work? So what they do is they simply don't expect you to repay your capital portion of the loan. Okay, then you say to me, but Rowan, they've stopped my whole payment. That's true. But your interest that's charged on your loan simply gets added to your loan value. So if you entered into this lockdown period with R1 million loan, and you've then opted to go for a payment holiday, you'll most likely find that after the 3 months, your loan has gone up from R1 million to about R1,020,000, roughly, due to the interest that's accumulated over the 3 months. So your loan amount simply grows because they add the interest to your loan, but they don't expect you to make any capital repayments. That obligation to repay your loan is taken away, and you don't have to service the interest in that particular month. It gets added to the loan and it gets repaid over the remaining term. Again, you're going to be paying interest on that money which you've accrued for the remaining term of your bond. So it's quite an expensive process, but it is one which offers good relief. So again, if you're going to be paying off that interest over 20 years or 15 years, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And nothing stops you in 6 months' time or 12 months' time to pay it off once off, to make it up, or to pay monthly in increments. And one of the answers and simple ways to look at it is, if you can upkeep your bond repayments that you were making prior to lockdown, or at the higher interest rates, you'll actually pay it off pretty quickly. Right. So refinancing, payment holidays. I think there's been some uncertainty too as to, are there any catches? Will I get blacklisted? Will it affect my credit score? And are there any penalties? I know there was a question who came through, asking, but what happens if I sell my home, after this lockdown period and after the payment holidays? Would there be any clawbacks from the bank? Would they charge me any penalties? And I think if you understand how these products work, in that they're simply adding, the interest to your loan, the answer becomes clear, and that's no. So there aren't any penalties if you were to sell now or at any other stage, because that interest amount that's accrued would be part of your settlement amount. Okay, again, so if your settlement prior to lockdown was R1 million, and you took the payment holidays for 3 months and you request a new settlement, in 3 months' time, your settlement would have grown by 3 months worth of interest, probably to around the 1,020,000 mark. So that in itself is your cost, and there's no additional penalties, if you were to sell your property again. Okay, I'm just going to check through some of the questions again quickly, which came beforehand. We'll get to some of the live questions now. And also, please, if you do have live questions, send them through. We'll be getting to them a bit later. Okay, one thing to remember that I made a note of is that payment holiday, when you then end up settling your bond or selling your property, there's no penalties. But just remember, there'll be the standard 90-day penalty interest if you don't notify the bank of the sale of the property. So if you are intending selling your property, make sure to notify the bank now already, so that you don't incur the 90-day penalty interest. That's not something that's unique because of the payment holidays. That applies to all mortgage loans. Okay. Then there was a question, interesting one, which came around transfer costs. Okay, so there was a statement. I think the question read, this person had somewhere seen that there had been relief on transfer costs, or the transfer cost threshold had been raised to R1 million recently, and that they'd read somewhere else that raising it to R3 million might be part of this answer. I went out saying, when it was raised from 900,000 rand to R1 million, I did the calculations and showed it to people, and I believe that that raising of 900 to R1 million is insignificant. It's really not going to make a dent. But I don't foresee there being any form of a relaxation from 1 million rand to 3 million rand. And then, just to clarify, it's not transfer costs, it's only transfer duty. So transfer costs are made up of a number of costs associated with transferring a property from one person's name into the other. And what could be included in there is your attorney's fee, postages and petties and deeds office fees, and a whole bunch of other fees, small fees. But the two major costs are normally the attorney cost, which is the cost of paying the conveyancer to effect the transfer. And then secondly, what's referred to as transfer duty. That's the tax that SARS charges, the levy that they charge on transferring a property from one person's name to the other, and the purchaser is responsible for paying it. So often people confuse the terminology, and because transfer duty and transfer costs are so similar, but it has a major difference, because if you're not paying any transfer duty, you'd still be liable for a portion of the transfer costs. Okay, you'll just get exclusion of paying the transfer duty. There's only one scenario or two scenarios where you don't pay transfer duty. The one is where the purchase price is under R1 million. SARS gives, they give you discounts in not charging you transfer duty. Or if the seller is a VAT vendor. Okay, so in most cases, when new developments are happening, the seller is a VAT vendor. And that is the reason why you don't pay any transfer duty, because SARS will either take their money in the form of transfer duty or in VAT, not both. Okay, so if you're buying from a VAT vendor, the seller is obliged to pay the VAT, and therefore the purchaser won't be charged transfer duty. Okay, transfer duty, R1 million threshold. Why is it at that R1 million threshold? Because it's a tax. like every other tax, it becomes more severe the higher the value of the product or the service or the income. So why there would be some form of relief below R1 million, that we could simply, answer that by saying it's there to help the more affordable spectrum of the market and not to burden them with additional taxes. Okay, so I don't foresee that being raised. I mean, obviously, we're happy to see it going from 900 to 1 million, but if you consider the amount of years which it was, sort of adjusted and at what percentages, I still think it's more severe than what it was in previous years, because property prices grow as well. So, that movement is just simply a movement along with some property price brackets. All right. Then we had another bunch of questions regarding the rental market. Okay, there was a number of you raised concerns regarding the rental market. Tenants' ability to make repayments. Sort of whether there'll be any shifts in those patterns. Specifically, one question came through asking, it's a good time to be buying investment properties, but what's going to happen if I don't have a tenant? And then there were other questions regarding tenants to say, well, do I have to pay do I have to pay my rent? And questions from landlords saying, but how do I determine whether I should be giving my tenants any form of relief or discounts? And how do we handle this? Can evictions be done? Is moving allowed? Or can legal proceedings be sort of instructed? So let's just spend some time on the rental side of things quickly. So in a nutshell, same as sales, rental agreements remain in place. Okay, you're obliged as a tenant to be paying your rent. In the same way, landlords are obliged to provide the property in the state in which is suitable for the tenant. So property owners, landlords have to be affecting. We have to be affecting maintenance to these properties. Okay, so it's all obligations and responsibilities in terms of lease agreements, they remain. There's no automatic relief for tenants. There was a lot of fake news circulating and saying, well, tenants can't be forced to pay. Tenants aren't obliged to pay. That's simply not true. That's simply fake news. All agreements of sale, all agreements of lease remain in effect, and obligations remain. Okay, that's the legal side. There's another side, another spectrum, which is the moral spectrum. And I think that's the difficult side that a lot of landlords and tenants are faced with. And there, if we look at the rental tribunal and we have a look at communication that we see them there, is we see that they place a humane obligation upon the landlord and the tenant to say, well, Mr. Tenant, you can't use this as an excuse to not pay rent. But Mr. Landlord, you also can't ignore, a tenant who's in a very real position, to not make payment. So in considering cases, I think the publications that I've seen coming from the rental tribunal is that every case will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. The merits of it will be heard, if it goes to the point of the tribunal. Merits will be heard, conditions will be, and circumstances will be looked at, and judgments will be made. And that can only be made after lockdown and once the tribunal, can be called upon again. This stage can't happen. So, if you are a tenant and you're able to pay your rent, I'm encouraging you to do that. Okay, because if you do unnecessarily withhold any payments, you could be in some trouble. In the same way, if a tenant has made a request upon a landlord to offer some form of relief and they are able to do so, I do think that should be looked at. If the landlord is not in a position to make to offer any form of relief, they can't be forced to. But I do think, this is a time for us to enter into discussions. And in saying that, there was one question that came through from a tenant to say, well, what if I can't pay my rent? What do I need to do? How do I apply for any form of relief? And I think what the simple answer is there is enter into discussions with your landlord, enter into discussions with your agent, get the discussion starting. There's no guarantee that you're going to get relief, but you need to enter into the discussion so that people can try and find solutions. Collectively, we can try and find solutions. Okay. Interesting figures, quickly coming back, so while we're at the rentals, sort of looking prior to, and we've got a pretty nice sample to look at. I think Janine looks after around 300 rental properties, so we've got a nice sample to look at. Prior to lockdown, the good standing ratio of the rental book was, that means on the 1st of every month, everyone pays in full. That would be good standing. The good standing rate of the book varies between 90 and 92%. That's some of the best figures that PayProp sees in the country. She's received a number of awards for that. So that's seen as some of the best properties, landlord and tenant relationships in the country. It can be seen in our books at 90 to 92% good standing ratio. That's where the levels have been at, sort of over the last 6 months. The 1st of May, that was reduced to 88.3%. Okay, so it's depending upon which month you look at, it's down somewhere between 2 and 4%. So that means in the 1st of May, 88.3% of all tenants paid their rental in full. Okay, as a norm, as a standard, usually about 8% of the book would be paying late or have some form of a payment arrangement. The encouraging thing to see is that 88% of these tenants have paid upfront, okay, and have paid on time. It's only about 3% of them that haven't been able to make those payments. But that 3% is not yet reflected, and that they may have payment arrangements or be making part payments. So you'll see that good standing would actually become better throughout the course of the month. So what we're actually seeing is that tenants are very much in a position where they can make repayments. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm by no means saying that they're making those payments easily. Like everybody, is not able to make payments easily, but they are making the payments. So if you're someone looking to make some form of an investment due to the reduced interest rates and rental, I think that's an encouraging sign. And I also think that if you have a look at the amount of leads that we are generating as a business during this time, because that's what I have to use to make my assessments, is that the rental leads are coming through strong. If you look at the advertisements that are being placed and the amount of leads that's being generated, the rental leads are coming through stronger than the sales leads at this stage. And so I don't foresee too much of a disaster in the rental space. I do think we're going to have a continuation of reduced interest or reduced escalations. How's it, PJ? Sien jy so kiso? I see Peter Joshua also just dropped a message to say we may see flat or downward pressure on escalation rates, and I agree with that. I don't think we're going to be seeing. I don't think we're going to be seeing interest or rental escalations. I think landlords are going to be respecting tenants and saying, guys, sort of let's ride this out together. I'm not going to be raising rentals and looking after. Again, case by case basis will need to be assessed. Some tenants might have been paying reduced rental for a number of years, and the landlord will be in no position but to raise. Others will be able to raise, because the tenant is unaffected. Again, it's a case by case basis. But if I needed to make a projection on the market as a whole, I do think we're going to see some stagnation in the rate at which rental increases. Okay, but we're not going to see a drastic rental demand going down. We might actually even see it climbing. Okay, so I think that should answer a lot of the rental questions that came through. And I think those figures, thank you, Janine, for providing us with those figures. As I said, good standing, meaning tenants making full payment of rent on the first of the month in sort of the 6 months prior to, that was sort of 90 to 92%, floating around those levels, down to 88.3% in May. And again, need to take into consideration that a lot of those people who are not in good standing on the first have made alternative payment arrangements throughout the course of the month. Okay, let's hope that that's answered some of the rental questions. Then, okay, another question to maybe just go back quickly, sorry, that I missed earlier, was regarding the payment holidays and what happens if at the end of the payment holidays I need to sell my home. Normal, I think you might have sort of reduced that from my answering, but just to answer that question directly, you follow processes as normal. You may have to engage with a bank to give you a further payment holiday, and you may need to engage with the bank to say, well, I'm in the process of selling my home, but to give you additional relief, but the sales process would be normal. I'd encourage you to get in contact with an agent early on, to get those processes going as quickly as possible if you find yourself in that position. There's a lot of literature that I've put out and written before about people who find themselves in distress. So pop onto our website, go into the news and advice section, and go and read up there. I've published a lot of advice previously for people who find themselves in difficult positions. If you need that resource, go there, or otherwise email me, phone me, we can have a discussion. I can give you some advice around there. Okay, let's just have a look quickly at some of the other questions. I think just to head back to pricing, some of the notes that I've made about the pricing questions again. What COVID-19, what effect it will have on property pricing. And we spoke about, the differences in the markets from 2008 until where it is now. Another thing that's been able to happen is that there's been huge stimulus, sort of packages being announced throughout being announced. This will help offset the effect of this current crisis. And if we have a look at the 2008 and prior recessions, 98, 2008, the stimulus packages that are being spoken about now absolutely trump any of the previous stimulus packages. They far outweigh anything that we've ever seen before. So I do think, that just to add to that, that's something that I didn't mention earlier, is the stimulus packages. They far Trump, not American Trump, but they far greater than what we've ever seen in history before. So right. Okay, then there was another question which came through, interestingly, surrounding property development. Okay, one of the questions actually went quite, sort of on a moral trend, as to asking, well, to sketch the scenario, this person asked the question to say, well, we've seen around the world that these densely populated cities are the hardest affected by COVID-19. And, that these densely populated cities have been conducive for sort of transmission and, seeing higher death rates and so on. And this places developers, the question that was proposed said, well, doesn't this put developers in a place where they need to now choose between profits and lives, and how will they consider that going forward? And I think you need to understand that we're in a free market system. We're in a capitalist system. these businesses cannot operate without profit. No matter how we sugarcoat that will always be the driving force. There will, however, I think, be a consciousness and an awareness that's awakened now. And I think there'll be different ways in which you'll see that awareness and consciousness being brought into the market. Similarly, I think demand, new property buyers are going to have certain demands that will be different, and that will put change, as to the course that developers take. Whether this will be a, sort of defining moment as to affecting change, or whether it will be an adjustment. I think it's the latter. I think it will be an adjustment. It will not be a defining change. This is temporary. COVID-19 and the effects of this is temporary. In 2-3 years' time, we're going to be looking back at this and we're going to have forgotten everything that, sort of happened. But there will be changes that will remain. So in terms of property development and developers and choosing between lives and profits, it's going to be profits. We can't sugarcoat that, because that's what makes the businesses tick. But I think there will be in consideration, and I think to try and portray the developers being sort of, the ones who have the scepter to swing with lives, I think is unfair. But what you will see is, simple changes. What happens, like the fingerprint access at a security estate? Are you going to be willing to put your finger on the fingerprint scanner, or are you now going to be insistent upon, sort of facial recognition? Are clubs, within estates going to have manually opening doors, or are there now going to be a move towards automatic doors? These sort of things. That I think is the way we will see, or the adjustments where we'll see changes starting to happen because of an awareness, because of a consciousness. There's not going to be a simple stop and change of direction. It will be gradual. In the same way, which I think is relevant, is the way that we view property. There's been this discussion about, what's going to happen to office spaces. Are people going to be more willing to work from home? Is everyone just going to be working from home now? What's going to happen to demand for office space? What's going to happen to demand for homes? How's it going to change? Nothing is going to happen quickly. Adjustments and changes like this don't happen overnight. But what we have become aware of during this period is that very often, office spaces, home office spaces that we have become accustomed to aren't sufficient. They're not conducive for doing weeks on ends worth of work. This space which I'm sitting in here is my home office, and it's a lovely space to work in. I've got my printer, I've got my own little garden outside the door here, which is like my little relaxation area. It's open. But even despite that, it's sort of the tail end of the property. And it's not a space which is conducive to business, sort of day in, day out for weeks on end. If I had to design my home with a intention of working from home more actively, I would give this space a lot more priority. I'd want it to be more in towards the garden spaces, sunlight spaces, open spaces. Maybe have different facilities, be sitting in front of a window instead of a wall. And these are things. These are things which we'll start taking into consideration, as a market. And again, these are the sort of incremental changes. The question is, will people now say, well, I've spent all this time in lockdown, I've had some reflection on what I want out of a property. I might be moving, homes. I might be working from home more regularly. Do I value a garden more? Do I value, sort of security and open spaces more. I think there's going to be shifts in the development space in demand, and I think there's going to be shifts in thoughts from developers' side. I think obviously properties will need to be more affordable. Properties will relatively more affordable, and that will force them to be smaller. But all of these things that we're discussing now for the past 5 minutes is the road in which the trajectory which we were on already. Businesses were already starting to decentralize. People were more receptive to working from home, and more and homes have access to home fiber, printers, these sort of things. People were already moving in that direction. Thoughts around workspace and home space were already moving. We're already moving towards smaller properties, more open spaces, more lifestyle orientated than property feature specific. This isn't a turning point where offices become empty and everyone's working from home, but it is definitely a thought changer, and definitely something which will have an influence on the way that we look at these things going forward. So I just want to catch up quickly to see. One of the questions also just regarding development was, how will the building trade be affected? Building trade of residential properties at this stage is still only in phase 2, along with us as agents. So yeah, that's difficult. Construction has been halted on our projects too. Good thing is that obviously banks are offering payment reliefs, and in some instances also on interim interest payments. But construction, will only be able to commence once they get to the approved level. When that is, I don't have that crystal ball. I don't know. Okay, so I think that covers the grouping of questions. I mean, I looked at the individual questions beforehand and try to group them in various sort of trends to see, how we looking, sort of at these questions. I just want to see. Okay, so let's go through I think we can start looking at the questions coming through on the emails and the comments. We've covered the interest rates, we've covered the payment holidays, the deeds office, the moving. I see there's been a lot of activity now on my WhatsApp and here on Facebook stating that there may be some changes regarding moving. I don't want to communicate them here because I can't verify them. But we'll communicate. We'll put out on our Facebook pages and sort of update us, everyone in our business as to what the regulations are there. I'm not going to try and sort of be the first out to break that news to you now. Let's rather spend some time to try and understand that and understand where we're at and how those things are being implemented. Okay, I'm going to head over to the emails and the comments now. So if you have any burning questions like where's my hair and things like that, feel free to drop them in the comment section and on the emails, and I'll start answering them shortly. Okay, so it does seem, and as I said, I don't want to be putting this out there as I can't verify it now, but it does seem like there are some amendments right now as we speak coming out to allowing sort of moves. to some form and some way. I don't know what that is just yet. Even if we see them on the newspapers and we see them in, on News 24 and those places, I think it's best if we take, sort of that guidance from the relevant authorities in our industries, and we'll get them through. So I'm going to head over to some of the comment section and some of the questions and comments that have been made, and maybe expand on them. So, all right, let's just check out here. Garth, I see you saying that losing your flexi is enough reason for you not to fix interest rates. I agree. I completely agree. Neil, ek sien hierso jy het iets gesê. Banks also said if you do take payment holiday, they may stop your access bond as well. Not sure what the time period is or when you can access that again. Neil, I'm also not sure. I would assume that would be the case. Obviously, because they're giving you the relief, they don't want you to be drawing, from that access again. But we can try and find that out for you guys. I'm sure we could have that answer in a couple of minutes to see. Okay. Natalie, I see you've asked the question, as to whether we can confirm that moving can be done. As I said, it seems like it's a live situation that's unfolding while I can't confirm that. Coming into this meeting, definitely not allowed. Seems like there may be some changes in that. Okay, it seems like Janine also received a gazette regarding exceptional circumstances in which tenants may move. I do believe that would probably cover things, with these vulnerable people. Okay, just remember, as Jason has also said, there'll always be terms and conditions to these, and very often those terms and conditions, don't make the headlines. So before you now go out and rush to make moves, give us a chance to just completely and fully understand this. Peter Gershaw, ek sien jy sê realities is that not many homes have two studies to accommodate a husband and a wife's daily working requirements. I agree 100%. And even they don't have, I'd go as far as to say they don't have the ability to accommodate one working, from home full time. So again, I said, I don't think this is a defining moment. But it will definitely have an effect and shape the way that we do look at things. Okay. Right, Dale, you've asked the question, what's my view on the future of large shopping malls? And on that, I actually want to encourage Peter Joshua, who's made a comment here. He's the specialist on sort of office space, and within their space, they've also got specialists on commercial and retail space. And I'd actually encourage him to maybe, going forward, host the question and answer session, something like this, where he can maybe answer those. But Dale, again, obviously, just from and this is not, I'm not actively involved in that market, but just as an outsider, obviously there's going to be pressures, and there'll be gradual, sort of shifts away from shopping, to online shopping and stuff. But I mean, it's gradual, and we were on that trajectory already. I think at the moment we're seeing an acceleration of certain instances, but we're definitely seeing, sort of an affirmation of others as well. I don't think there'll be a drastic change immediately, but there may be some changes in the way that they function and operate. I think this is maybe one of those things where the question is, will turnover rents remain? Will the structure of turnover-based rents remain the same? Will landlords possibly force tenants to have, some form of security and insurance for non-payment of rent in circumstances like this. Those are some things which may be considered. Major anchors may need smaller space because they're reverting to more online space. We're seeing it with the banking sector, we're seeing it with the retail sector, we're seeing it with a number of sectors. But like with the commercial and shopping malls, the same as what we're seeing in residential space, is that some of the functions have been reinforced more than ever. One of these is this sort of idea that there may have been, is that real estate agents are going to be replaced by some form of technology. Now, I think this period has shown that that's absolutely not the case. The amount and the volume of transactions being concluded remotely without any intervention of human, sort of form it's non-existent. It's drips and drabs in the bigger picture. So yes, there have been buyers and sellers who are able to and commit, remotely, but 99% of people will simply say, "But I'm willing to go this whole way, but I just want to check that property with you quickly before sort of lockdown, once lockdown's over, and for us to proceed." And there's also a lot of trust, being placed in people. And again, the same way, that's one of the aspects that's been emphasized and highlighted again in our spectrum. And in the same space, I think in the commercial space and retail space, there'll be certain things which will be highlighted, like in the office space. Certain office spaces just are conducive to productivity when people are together. So we can't think that things are just going to overnight, sort of tumble in. I don't foresee that happening. Rish, ek sien jy vra oor 'n kopers versus verkopersmark. Dis een van die goeders wat vir my altyd ek kan nooit verstaan hoe mense dink aan 'n kopers of 'n verkopersmark nie. It can never be a buyer or a seller's market in its truest form, because today's buyer is tomorrow's seller, or today's seller is tomorrow's buyer. If you're selling to buy something, you're a seller on the one end and you're a buyer on the other end. And the only time that you could ever refer to a purist buyer or seller's market is when you'll be entering into a property once off, or exiting a market once off. There'll always be in a continuation. And then if we look at the pricing versus interest rate, correlation over time, most properties are being bonded or have some form of a rental income if they're cash. The two always meet each other at some point in time. So I think buyers and sellers market is something that is used and thrown around quite easily and spoken about, because it's the easy lingo of talking up the market. I think what real estate agents need to learn, ourselves included, to a large extent, is price sensitivity. And how price sensitivity affects demand and supply. Because often changes in price sensitivity are reflected as a buyer's or a seller's market. People say, "Oh, well, it's a buyer's market. Everything's, the conditions are, awesome for purchasing." But the whole picture, the ability and the circumstances under which you can buy or sell, aren't taken into account. So this idea that there's an outright buyers or outright sellers market, or this ideal time to buy or this ideal time to sell, doesn't exist unless you're doing it once off. That's my opinion and my thought. And I challenge people to prove me otherwise. Unless you're completely removing yourself from all markets, I don't think you could time that thing perfectly. And if you were to try and time it by removing yourself from the market at one stage and getting in at another, you'd lose out on so much opportunity along the way. The best thing that you can do is to make informed decisions along that way. So yes, the environment is conducive to purchasing, with low interest rates and good terms from the banks and pretty lenient conditions. So that makes sort of purchasing in environment attractive, but again, when purchases are enabled, it does make the environment for the sellers with good stock, it makes it quite attractive for them to be moving to. Okay, so right, there's another question coming through from Yushrik, Dolly. What advice do you have for young individuals starting out in this time? Yushrik, I think the most important bit of advice that I can give you, and I think it's going to be good if you join in for my property buyers workshop, is to be conservative and realistic. Be conservative in your decision making, be realistic in your decision making. Don't overextend yourself. Don't be buying on the absolute limits. But also don't delay getting into the market, because the only people who will benefit from a downturn, when it turns to an upturn, are property owners. People who actually own. So, Yushrik, so to give you some advice, again, I say don't delay, sort of getting into the market because of uncertainty. Rather try and navigate and find ways to deal with that uncertainty and plot a vision for what you want to achieve. Plot a vision and try and forecast and look at to how your needs will be changing in the next number of years to limit the amount of times you need your property to change hands. Because every time it changes hands, there's agents' commissions and transfer duties and. Okay, so what you want to be trying doing is looking forward as how that property can serve multiple needs. I've got a little story that I tell, a personal story at my buyers workshop, which I'll share with you if you join in there. I don't want to get caught up in too much of the details here tonight, but if good advice that I can give you is it's an excellent time. The environment, the landscape for purchasing is excellent. Okay, so if you are in a position to qualify for a loan, and if you're in a position to make those repayments and to actually get into the market, it's an excellent time to be doing so. If you are in a position to do it. Okay, so if you're not and you're looking at making sacrifices to do it, make sacrifices, to get in. Looking at a lot of projections from a lot of economists over the past time, and everyone seems to think that there's going to be a huge sort of injection into the market coming in 2021, and sort of that there'll be quite a rapid recovery post COVID-19. When post COVID-19 is, I don't know, no one knows, but they do seem to feel that there's going to be quite a strong and quick recovery. So I do think that it's a good time to be buying. Market conditions from a financing perspective and a repayment perspective are very favorable at this stage. Okay. Ek sien Jaco, ek sien jy sê never a better time to buy than now. Ek stem saam. Jy weet, again, there's and whether now is now today, or whether now is 6 weeks time or 2 weeks time or 6 months time, now is now. One day is one day. You need to get in. Don't whether it's perceived to be a good or bad time to get into the market. Rather try and determine a clear vision and strategy to make a good decision. So, okay, Natalie, I see you say thanks. You'll wait for the official announcement regarding the moving. Yeah, I see here on my screen the WhatsApp lines and stuff are going crazy with people sharing opinions. Again, in times of uncertainty, I think just hold back and rather take 5 minutes to understand it before we put out things. Okay, because there'll definitely be terms and conditions. Okay. Right. Let's just have a look. All right, guys. I think that sort of covers most of the questions that have come through in the comments. So I hope I've answered a lot of the questions and maybe taken away some sort of uncertainty that you may have had. I think this question and answer session, was mostly dominated by questions around COVID-19, and maybe we'll look at doing this going forward and covering some other topics. I want to leave you with 5 more minutes of thought. something which I found pretty, sort of useful in this time. I watched a webinar by the Optimum Investment Group, and Theo, trying to think quickly what Theo's surname was. He's a political analyst and a policy specialist at the Northwest University. Let me just quickly, it's going to bother me now. See what is Theo Fenter, that's right. I think it's Theo Fenter. There we go. So it's Theo Fenter. He's a political analyst, and he's a policy specialist at the Northwest University. And I listened to a talk that he had, and one of the things that he stuck on was, the sort of doom and gloom projections that some people are making, and to try and understand where they come from, and how to deal with it. And he sketched a scenario which he called the VUCA environment, so VUCA, with each of the letters meaning something. V for volatility, U for uncertainty, C for complexity, and A for ambiguity. And he was saying this VUCA environment, is ideal and for people to, sort of portray doom and gloom, and that's where it comes from. And he then gave tips in overcoming this, and in stating that a volatile market, or volatile circumstances, which is scenarios that are constantly changing. Volatility must be taken on head on by looking at risk assessment and, considering risks in this ever changing environment. And the best way to combat volatility was with another V, which was vision, and putting out a future path and vision and plan, which would be your compass, sort of in these times when making decisions, which I thought was pretty useful. The uncertainty, he described as being in an environment in which it's hard to anticipate and predict what is, going to happen in future, and patterns that will occur. And the way to sort of challenge uncertainty would be to spread your boundaries and to come up with innovation and new plans, and new ways of doing things, to then ultimately change this uncertainty into a space of understanding, where you can reflect on the context of this uncertainty and talk and have these discussions like we're having, sharing information. Okay, then spoke about the C being complexity, an environment where things are complex and multi-layered and intertwined, and it's difficult to understand, and he said through working through complexity, we should try and find solutions which mirror the environment or the position we find ourselves in, to create the opposite C, which was clarity, which helps us find ways in dealing with our current situation and the environment in which we find ourselves. And the last one of this VUCA environment, which you spoke of, was ambiguity. Saying that ambiguity is where the fake news comes from, and practices and dogmas that we've become accustomed to and used to are thrown out the door, because they won't work. It's uncharted territory, and this ambiguity, in an ambiguity space, there's no black and white, and there's a lot of fake news. And by making shifts in our thought patterns and making encouraging decisions where we can create flexible decision making, but also coupled with taking accountability for our decision making, that allows us to be agile. Okay, and he created this picture where we can take this VUCA environment, which he speaks of, which is dominated by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and we can change it into an environment where we create for ourselves a vision, understanding of where we're at, chasing that to create clarity and being agile and able to adapt. So I hope, guys, that this session has been helpful and useful in that way, that it's helped you understand and maybe share some thoughts as to where we're at. So thanks for tuning in. I think that's just about all of the questions. I don't know if there was anything that came in, sort of right at the end, but I want to encourage you guys to say it's tough times. Obviously, judging from the questions, you can see that sort of that's what's on people's minds. But we're figuring this out as we go along, and we're all in it together. So I don't think, obviously, individual concerns. One of the things that we need to be wary of is portraying individual concerns onto the market, and accepting that everyone is in that space. Yeah, so just quickly, I see there's some last comments coming in. Marie, you're asking, some buyers have the view that the full impact of COVID-19 will only be evident in September, October, and opportunities will then be more favorable. What's my view on that? I don't know. Don't have a crystal ball, but in saying that, we have to try and sort of anticipate. That's one of the things which is in uncertainty. It's difficult to anticipate where we're at. I think the best thing that you can do is to create that vision and strategy as to what you want to do in buying or selling, and put it out and actually put it into effect. And start preparing for that, so that if there is opportunity that arises, or if there is desperation that arises, that we can actually move and adapt quickly. Again, I don't think that there's going to be this downward pressure on sales and auctions and everything that goes along with it, for the reasons that I explained earlier on in the video. Neil, last week, and looking at what happened in the financial markets and the economy, the most sustainable assets keeping up with value, in my opinion, regardless whether you have tenants or are homeowners. And it is property. Thanks, Rowan. Okay, Neil, thank you. Yeah. If you guys are keen, obviously a lot of the questions have come around the investment side of things too. I've been reluctant to do this, but I'm gonna, again, like everything else, I'm forced to make change and to accelerate where my trajectory where we already were. I'll be doing some of these sessions on investment and maybe specific things in investments and buying, going forward next week and so on. So please, if you haven't, like our Facebook page, keep up, sort of up to date on our website and our Facebook page, and look out for the next sessions. But thanks, guys. Hope this was helpful.